David J. Brown has interviewed the world's most creative and controversial thinkers. These interviews are chronicled in 4 books: Voices from the Edge, Conversations on the Edge of the Apocalypse, Mavericks of Medicine, and his first book of interviews, Mavericks of the Mind, which has just been reissued in expanded form. In this program, David talks about 2 of the 4 interviewees who have influenced him most: psychologist and science fiction writer Robert Anton Wilson, and Timothy Leary, the most intelligent and the funniest man that Robert Anton Wilson ever met. David, another of the 4 people who've really had an influence on your life was Robert Anton Wilson. And Robert had a PhD in psychology. He was associate editor of Playboy magazine. He was a science fiction writer, and he was a stand-up comic. How well did you know him?
Bob was one of my best friends and one of the most important inspirations of my life. I'll tell you something funny about how I met Bob. When I was writing my first book, Brainchild, I went to a lecture that Robert Anton Wilson was giving, and after the lecture, I went up and spoke to him and told him that I was working on a book. And since his books had such a profound influence on me, and since I was so interested in his work, I asked him if it would be possible, if perhaps maybe he could write just a short blurb for the back cover of my book.
Right.
And at the time, he looked at me and kind of hemmed and hawed and didn't sound terribly enthusiastic about doing it. And I had my publisher send him a copy of the book and was absolutely astonished and deeply surprised that he ended up writing an 11-page introduction to the book. Uh-huh. So that was how I met him, was through that process. And when I was living in Los Angeles and when I was living in Santa Cruz, coincidentally, we both happened to be living in the same places at the same time. And for a period of about 15 years, once a week, I would go to Bob's house for what were our reading groups and discussion groups. And we would read from James Joyce, Ulysses, or from Finnegan's Wake, or we would read from some of Bob's books like the Illuminatus trilogy. Mm-hmm. And then we would stop at different points and Bob would explain and we would discuss different aspects of these things. And sometimes we would watch movies and discuss them. But this went on for about 10 to 15 years. I did this with Bob. And I can't tell you how much I miss him. But one of the most interesting things is right before Bob died, one of his last books that he wrote, Zog, he asked me to write a blurb for the back cover. Uh-huh. So after having been influenced by him and have that being my entry into the world of literature, it was the most profound thing for me and the most heart-touching thing for me that I got to write a blurb for the back cover of one of his last books.
Uh-huh. Well, the blurb for the back cover of your book, Brainchild, he wrote, David is an evolutionary meteorologist, carefully scanning the latest scientific readouts and forecasting the weather right ahead of us on this time track. That seems to fit you very well. How did you react to that?
Well, that means a lot coming from Robert Anton Wilson, who's been called by New Scientist magazine as the most scientific of all science fiction writers. Uh-huh. So the fact that he saw my scientific predictions in my novel as being accurate was tremendously supportive and inspirational.
Right.
So.
What inspired your book, Brainchild?
My book, Brainchild, was inspired largely by the work that I did when I was at New York University. I did electrical brain stimulation research for 2 years there. And while I was there, we were inserting electrodes into the lateral hypothalamus of rats and having them press little bars over and over again to reward their pleasure centers. And this was very limited work, I thought, in terms of how far I could really, utilize my creativity. Mm-hmm. And after I finished up my master's degree, I was driving cross country, and in the process of driving cross country and smoking copious amounts of cannabis, this whole idea bubbled up in my mind as a story. And by the time I had gotten to California, I had the whole thing outlined, and spent the following year writing it.
Yeah, Robert Anton Wilson called himself an agnostic mystic. What did he mean by this?
Well, I think that he meant that he doesn't necessarily believe in divine intelligence, doesn't necessarily not believe in divine intelligence, that there may be some aspect to creation that is intentional. Mm-hmm. The idea that one is an atheist or a believer was something he was trying to avoid, I think. By saying he was agnostic, he was taking a scientific approach and saying, I'll be able to judge by my own experience. By putting the word, what did he say, mystical or transcendental, before agnostic. He would use both, I know.
Right.
He was trying to acknowledge that he had had experiences that seemed to indicate that there was something greater than human consciousness, that there may be something more, but he wasn't going to dogmatize about it or limit his belief by accepting that as the ultimate reality. So he was trying to be as scientific as he could with that.
Right. He was influenced by Korzybski's book, Science and Sanity, which stressed getting back to a nonverbal level so as to be able to perceive without talking to yourself while perceiving.
Yes. Yeah, I'll tell you another thing interesting about Korzybski that influenced Bob is that Bob wrote several books without using the word is.
I heard that, yes.
Yes, that was influenced by Korzybski. And because Bob doesn't believe that anything equals anything else except for that thing itself. And whenever you say something is something else, you're creating an erroneous statement.
Right. Well, did you try that in your own writing?
I try that. I do try that in my own, and I use words like it appears to be, or it seems to be, or I really try to actually do that. Yes.
And how does that help you?
I think that it does help me to be more precise and to understand things in a more natural way.
Right. You posed the question to Robert about what happens to consciousness after physical death. What was his response to that?
That Bob's response to that was that, well, I asked him that question twice, actually. I interviewed him for Mavericks of the Mind and this book, and I also interviewed him for Conversations on the Edge of the Apocalypse as well. The one in Conversation on the Edge of the Apocalypse was the more recent of the two. And basically what he did was he said that there were 5 possibilities that he could think of, I think. 4 or 5. So he said there was the heaven-hell scenario, there's the reincarnation scenario, there's the nothingness scenario, there's the union with God scenario. And he said that out of those different scenarios, he thought that the one that seemed the most plausible to him, and the one that if he had an actual choice, was the union with God, because that seemed to him like an acid trip that just didn't end.
I think he said that consciousness is a non-local function of the universe as a whole, and our brains are only local receivers.
That was the first time I interviewed him. Yes, that was the first time he said that. Yeah, he said, and then he followed that statement with, "But I'm not going to dogmatize about it."
Oh. Yeah. How did Robert influence your life?
In so many ways. God, it's hard to even pinpoint. His book, Cosmic Trigger, was such an important point in my life when I read that book. Most of the people that I interviewed, I discovered through reading Cosmic Trigger. Everyone from Timothy Leary and John Lilly and Rupert Sheldrake, on up through Noam Chomsky and.
What was Cosmic Trigger about?
Cosmic Trigger was his sort of biography. It was about his own experiments with consciousness, using different types of psychedelics, and his readings with different philosophers and different explorers who had also tried to map out these different states of consciousness. And he would go back and forth between describing what these different philosophers believed and modeled about their experiences, and his own experiences, which were just fascinating. And it was through that process that I had really committed myself to becoming a writer, as I was really inspired by his work and wanted to follow in what he was doing and carry on his work. And that's what I feel like I'm still doing.
Right. You also interviewed Timothy Leary, and Timothy was the last of the 4 important people that we're going to talk about today. But you interviewed him when he was on his deathbed. Had you known him before?
Yes, I knew Tim for about 10 years before he died.
How did you meet him?
I first met Tim through my friend Nina Gruboy. Took me to meet him at his house in Beverly Hills. And when I was living in Los Angeles, I got close with him and used to hang out at his house. And I interviewed him several times. Both of the interviews are in our book, Mavericks of the Mind. I wasn't actually there when Tim died, but I was there. I interviewed him during the last year that he was alive, and after he had announced to the media that he was dying. And he spoke quite a bit about death. And one of the most powerful things that Tim said at that time that really made an impression on me was that Tim said that he was ecstatic to be dying. And I just loved that. There was quite a lot of people who have tried to make dying noble and to die with grace and dignity. But it was really Tim's brilliant idea to make dying fun. Nobody in human history had thought to do that before. To make dying fun, to party, to celebrate your life during the last year. I thought that was just absolutely brilliant, and it made a beautiful impression.
How did he celebrate it?
But there was constant parties going on, constant people. There was constant celebration in his house. It was the last year was one big party at Tim's house.
You know, I'm amazed at how many people in their 30s have never heard of Timothy Leary, and I can't help but wonder how so many people living today can be oblivious of the currents that have shaped the world we live in. Timothy Leary had quite an impact on the world. What do you think his impact was?
I think that one could really argue that Timothy Leary made more people happy than anybody else in human history. That he taught techniques for increasing human happiness that were more effective, I think, than anybody else in human history. He helped to create the psychedelic revolution in the 60s, which was instrumental in helping to stop the Vietnam War. He helped to create the computer revolution in the 80s, which was instrumental in creating the internet. So he's had a very, very profound effect on American culture, on human culture, and you can find his influence everywhere you look, from commercials to songs to paintings. There's influence of Timothy's work.
Right, but he was also instrumental in getting psychedelics banned.
He was. A lot of people were very upset about what Timothy was doing at the time, and I would actually argue that Andrew Weil had a bigger impact on getting psychedelics banned than Timothy Leary.
I remember something that he did was it at Harvard?
It was at Harvard.
What did he do?
Well, what happened was that he was the person who basically got Tim and Richard Alpert, i.e. Ram Dass, thrown out of Harvard because of the work that they were doing. The administration at Harvard wasn't too happy with their LSD work, but there was really no complaints. So nobody was, really complaining about what they were doing. What happened was, at least according to the book, the Harvard Psychedelic Club, was that...
That book has just come out, has it?
Yes. The book just came out. I believe the author's name is John Larson. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend the book. And he talks about how Andrew Weil was, and he admits to this and has apologized for this, so this is not slander, that he was feeling jealous, that Andrew Weil was feeling jealous of his roommate who was getting to do psilocybin with Richard Alpert.
Right.
As a result of that jealousy, he wrote an article for the Harvard Crimson, the school newspaper, about what the professors were doing and how they were giving psychedelic drugs to undergraduate students. And this is what set off such a controversy and outraged people. And as a result, Tim and Richard Alpert got thrown out of Harvard.
Leary wrote the psychedelic experience with Ralph Metzner and Ram Dass in the 60s.
Right.
And he compared the dying process with the stages of the Bardos and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He felt that the respectful use of psychedelics could be a kind of dress rehearsal for death. Could you see that in the last year that you were with him?
Yes, in fact, that's what he kept telling me. He said that psychedelics were a rehearsal for death, and that most people were not properly prepared and hadn't rehearsed enough. And he actually saw his own death not just as something that needed to be rehearsed for, but as a performance.
Right.
And I think that he had actually thought very carefully about what his last words were going to be, and gave a lot of thought to that, and repeated his last words over and over again as he was dying, as if to make sure that we didn't forget.
Yeah. Could you tell us what those were?
His last words were, "Why not?
Oh.
Why not? Why not?" He kept saying it over and over again. He said, "Why? Why? Why? Why not? Why not? Why not? Why not?" And he almost started chanting it. Why not? Why not?
And what do you make of that? Why not?
I think he was sort of putting a sort of addendum onto everything that he had done his whole life about advancing human evolution and elevating human consciousness, and asking, well, why not?
So the why not was actually an expression of his ecstasy.
Yes.
Yeah. Leary is quoted as saying, "Death is the ultimate control mechanism by which human beings can be rendered helpless. What did he mean by this?
I think he meant the fear of death,
Okay.
more than death, but the fact that human beings are so afraid of death makes them very vulnerable to people who can manipulate their beliefs around death. So I think he was primarily talking about religious institutions that can have such a strong effect on people's belief systems.
Right.
And yeah.
Leary reportedly made arrangements to have his head removed and cryonically suspended, and there are other reports that he was cremated and had his ashes rocketed into space. What happened?
His body was cremated, and his ashes were rocketed into space. Is what actually happened. He had made plans to have his head severed and to have it stored in cryonic suspension. He decided in the end not to have it done. The people who were going to do it was a group called Alcor.
Right.
And they were at his house quite a bit during the final stages while he was dying. And Tim got very upset with them standing around with clipboards too much and didn't want to wake up standing in a sterile laboratory 50 years later with a bunch of scientists standing around him with clipboards, he said. Mm-hmm. But I think that, really towards the end what happened was that Timothy just really let go of his body. It seemed that he really wasn't as attached to his body.
You weren't there when it happened?
I wasn't there when he died, but it seemed like that was the process that was going on because I know he was very gung-ho for cryonic suspension, and I know that even as he was dying, he still thought it was a viable option for people. Right. But he himself did decide not to do it in the end.
Mm-hmm. How did Timothy Leary influence your life?
Oh, so profoundly. It's hard for me to say, but I think he helped me to become a more optimistic person. A lot of the optimism that I put out in my writing and right here in this interview that I'm doing came from my work with Timothy and from being inspired by him. He was such a, he was really committed to the idea that putting out an optimistic message to the world really helps to make the world a better place. There are so many people who are talking pessimistically that it just seems like an obvious thing to be doing if you want to make the world a better place. His model of the brain, the 8-circuit model of the brain, I think is probably the best model of consciousness in the mind that's ever been developed. I think it incorporates everything that, that Sigmund Freud did, that Carl Jung did, that, all the previous, giants in psychology basically laid the groundwork for. All their models are incorporated into Tim's model, but he explains so much more, and he also explains how this process of individual development is mirrored in the process of evolution and draws a correlation between individual development and evolution. Mm-hmm. And that idea profoundly influenced me.
Right. You have interviewed the most creative and controversial thinkers of our time, and you have delved into the mystery of consciousness with them. As you look back on your life as this 26-year-old just starting your interview with Terence McKenna and traced it to your most recent interview, are you amazed at what you've done? Are you amazed that you have done this?
Sometimes, sometimes I'm just amazed to be alive. It depends on where you put the amazement point. I can be amazed just to be a human being and be alive. That can be amazing. But yeah, every so often it does hit me that I've been pretty fortunate to be able to interview some of the most incredible people on the planet. Uh-huh.
Are there positives as well as negatives that have come from this? I imagine your perspective has been broadened substantially, and there aren't very many people that you can talk to about issues that really are important to you. Have you thought about this?
Well, to some extent, that's true. But there's also such an immense feeling of connection when you connect with other people who share what you share that the average person doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's such a beauty in when people elevate their consciousness and encounter other people who have also elevated their consciousness. There's such an immense sense of instant connection, and there's such beauty in that connection. Mm-hmm. that, and I think that that's kind of what you're getting at a little bit in your question, although it's not particularly the focus of it. But I think ultimately that if you get alienated from people because you've elevated yourself to a higher level, mm-hmm. then when you connect with other people who have also done that, then there's such beauty in that. And I feel like I have. I know people all over the world who I feel know at least as much as I do about consciousness and psychedelics, and I've developed a tremendous community, of people. So I don't really feel alienated. I feel like I'm part of this, amazing network. But there've definitely been times in my life where I felt like what I've learned and what I know made me feel different than other people. And as a result, it forced me to find other people, and how joyous it's been to find other people who share, what I do.
Right. David, what do you fear? I imagine that after talking with so many people who are aware of what's going on in the world, that you also have become aware, and after interviewing so many people who are aware, has this generated any fear in you?
Well, I try very hard to work towards a state where I'm not afraid. I try really hard to face my fears and to face the things that I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of the things that every human being's afraid of. I get afraid of death. I get afraid of things not working out. I get afraid of the human species possibly destroying itself. Those things are genuine fears that I've experienced and that I try to address and that I try to diminish as best I can. But I think probably my biggest fear is of being boring to God.
Being boring to God?
I feel like that's the biggest sin and the worst thing you could do, at least according to my friend John Lilly.
How does one become boring to God?
I don't know, but I certainly don't want to find out. So that's why I'm trying to be as interesting as I can.
Yeah, why did John Lilly say that? You interviewed him, of course, and had some experiences. Did you ever go into his tanks?
I used to work at an isolation tank center when I was in college, and I logged hundreds of hours in those isolation tanks. And when I used to stay on John's property, he had one I used to use quite a bit. So I've been in them quite a bit. I haven't been in one in a while, right, but I've had quite a lot of experience in those tanks.
Do you have one particular memory that comes up when you were in this tank? Did anything extraordinary happen?
Oh, not one particular time, but many times.
Cite one.
Well, let me just say what happened over and over again.
Sure.
I mean, what would happen in these experiences was almost as profound as doing LSD or a psychedelic. It was like going into a lucid dream every time. After I was in the tank for, I'd say, about an hour or so, I would feel like my body separated from my mind, and I no longer could even operate my limbs. I would try to pull my hand up, and something would go up, but it wasn't my arm. Uh-huh. And I would go into a state that was a lot like being in a lucid dream, only I had far more conscious control, and I knew that I wasn't dreaming. Mm-hmm. So it was very profound. And on a few occasions, I actually, did psychedelics in the tank, and it's very, very hard to even begin to describe what happens in those experiences. But basically, I felt like I came out of time and was able to go into any point in my life and view that from an objective point of view.
Uh-huh. Yeah. David, when you were 16, you had your first LSD trip, and you realized that the brain entirely creates what we experience as reality. You said that, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you also said that since we are responsible for creating reality individually and jointly, what then are the most fabulous and interesting realities that we can experience? Now, I know that you started off Mavericks of the Mind in 93 by questioning the paradigms that were in place at that time. So what new paradigm can you imagine that might lead to the most fabulous and interesting realities that we can experience?
Well, I really tried to explore that question in my book Brainchild. That was sort of the motivation behind writing that book, was to try to imagine the most incredible realities that I possibly could. I think the paradigm that would support being going. I think the most. Let's put it this way. The best thing that we could be moving towards is externalizing our imagination. I see that as the goal of evolution, is getting to a place where our imagination becomes externalized in physical reality. And I think that we're moving to a stage where through nanotechnology, through artificial intelligence, through robotics and quantum computing, we're going to be able to externalize our imaginations. And then being able to externalize our imaginations through these different technologies, I think that we should try to work towards a state where we're moving towards human happiness and human pleasure. Science and medicine have been, all throughout history, have been motivated towards, say, the cure of disease or the solving of problems. And there's never been a science of pleasure. There's never been a science that's devoted to, say, researching how to make people happier, how to experience pleasure more deeply. And I think that this could be an actual area of scientific research. I mean, one thing that we could look into right away is ways of enhancing sensory experience. Anything that enhances your senses would enhance pleasure in a pleasurable setting. So I think that an all-out research campaign that's based upon, the enhancement of human pleasure would be a really good way to go with this. And then externalizing the imagination and external reality would be the...
I can't help but remember that you're working with Annie Sprinkle on a book.
Yes.
Sex on Drugs.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, is this a totally unrelated subject, or can you say a few brief words about where that book is going?
Well, Annie and I have been colleagues for a while. We teach workshops together about how different drugs affect sexuality. Everything from antibiotics and barbiturates up through psychedelics, how with the effect of things that enhance and things that actually decrease sexuality or performance or sexual ability. And the book that we're doing together, Sex on Drugs, is primarily about how people have had their sexual experiences affected by psychedelics. But we go into much more depth in our actual workshops when we explore how all drugs affect sexuality.
Right. Why is this important for us now? I mean, how do psychedelics affect sexuality?
Well, I think psychedelics affect everything. They affect sexuality by enhancing the sensations that go with it, as well as the emotions that go with it, as well as undefined energies and processes that mystics have only described as things like kundalini or chi or things like that. There's all kinds of powerful energies that people become cognizant of or aware of when they have sex on psychedelics. If you've ever seen a painting by Alex Gray,
right,
you get an idea of
yes,
what people see on psychedelics or experience on psychedelics when they're having sex. But I think that psychedelics are so important right now, not so much because they enhance sex, that's wonderful that they do, and they enhance creativity too, that's also wonderful. They do a lot of wonderful things, I think. It's too bad they're against the law, but the really important and most vital thing, I think, about psychedelics and why I think they're so important is because they increase ecological awareness and ecology. And
how do they do that?
I think because they melt boundaries, they break down boundaries between people and each other, between people and the environment, and it no longer becomes you and the environment as being something separate, but it just almost becomes like a selfish thing to take care of the environment because the environment's part of you.
Mm-hmm. So it's not exclusively intellectual. You also feel this?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
How do you feel it?
It becomes this common sense, the same way that you would say the sky's blue, the same way that you feel that you're a body right now. It just becomes self-evident because it's your experience. Uh-huh. And then you can go back, and then you can actually find scientific models that support your experience. But during the psychedelic experience, it's one of experience.
Right. David, I see the sun is going down, and the quality of our light is becoming dimmer. And I'd like to thank you so much for talking about these fascinating subjects. And perhaps we might be able to do another interview at sunrise.
That'd be wonderful. It'd be wonderful. It's been a great pleasure, Mel. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you so much.